put auto rotate for my phone while I was going live earlier, but thanks for bearing with me. I did get the feedback that the orientation was off and things look a bit tiny, so hopefully now everything seems to be much better. So I think right now round 6 is ongoing. Basically they're playing 7 rounds for day 1 in terms of the Swiss pairings, and then day 2 they'll be playing another 4 more rounds, a total of 11 rounds before deciding the semi-finalist for the afternoon day 2. So I believe in the World Othello Championship, when you have 13 rounds, typically you need 10 rounds or 10 wins or 10 points basically to try to qualify for the semifinals on day 2. For 11 rounds, maybe you might need something like 8 wins just to be sure to enter the semifinals. So let's see how it turns out. Let me just refresh the page for this. So on the left, again, you have flipthedisc.com, which shows the event. Right now, they're playing round 6. They're paired. So Kurita against Satani and Ogura against Shimomura. So over here, you can see the Chinese player and Australian Scott now coming up to pair against the top Japanese. I think my suspect is that the rest of the rounds are going to feature a lot of Japanese at the top few tables, while intermittently meeting non-Japanese players. So let's see how that goes. If I just jump into the website, I think I'll be able to see the game. So if we just look at this, the game has started. Kurita is playing more like a rose opening. So I think maybe that's some way that he wants to kind of go out of book against Satani for this game. So let's go back. Yeah, so let's just go into the standings. Maybe we can take a quick look at the standings. So again, you can see it's dominated by Japanese. Kurita currently with 5 out of 5 points. Satani a close 4.5. And over here you can see the Japanese dominating the field. So for Singapore, you can see Kelvin and Anthony is coming up. Scott representing Australia, still at the top. But of course, for now, it's still hard to say because it's only round 6 and anything can happen for the next 5 rounds. So I think consistency and endurance is key to such tournaments. So maybe let's take a look at some of the games that I didn't cover earlier. So maybe we can look at Tanida against Joanna. So over here you can see Tanida playing as black, and Joanna plays the diagonal opening against him, and Tanida goes to Heath opening. So I think Joanna typically plays very unconventional openings, so maybe that gives a possibility to throw Mr. Tanida off. But at the same time, you can see so what white and black is doing over here is basically to exchange moves into the center. You can see more or less they're trying to grab the center, and you can see basically they want to control the center, and at the same time the main centralizing axis over here would be the G5 disc to E7 disc. So over here, white, it's not surprising to kind of see white trying to play H6 just to control this line, because you don't want black to cut back. But over here, black is happy to kind of just go towards the center, and white is, by playing G3, is actually a very strong forcing move for black to actually either go to H3 or H6. I think typically I would prefer H3 in a way, so that I can get H2 in the future as well. But given that currently black doesn't have access to H4, maybe Mr. Tanida preferred to play H7 just to grab the H. And I think that's also still a very strong sequence of moves. So over here, white is, I think, losing slightly in tempo, but at the same time, white is still trying to maintain its center shape, as you can see. So black beats off white, and then black jump into the center. I think this game is entirely dominated by black, so it'll be interesting to see how black actually lost the game, I guess. Yeah. I'm pretty sure I think black is in a very good, comfortable position over here. So white is probably trailing by a lot. and black takes the edge over here to h4. White takes the minimal disk flip to b3. So essentially what white is trying to do, because given that all the moves are poisoned, white wants to retain as much centralized position as much as possible. So black essentially has the game won from my point of view over here, but let's see how black kind of lost the game. So white takes one this over here, so it's a strong move, even though white is probably still losing at this position, because white essentially wants to control the c4 to d3 mini diagonal to prevent a cutback. So over here, black jumps out to e2, which is not surprising, because you want to kind of shorten the gap towards h3 and create some excess. At the same time, you want to look for some excess to b5 to centralize. So nothing too surprising over there. So black jumps into e2. White prevents it by playing f1. So over here, you have a few options. One is you jump into e1 and then maybe e1, d1, but that will be the standard sequence, and then you cut back to b5. That's one option. Another option is to simply just ignore that and just play out h3, which would tend to be my preferred option, because h3 is a move that is open for contest, and if black leaves it unguarded, that opens up an opportunity for white to kind of attack it in the future. So if I just select the put option over here, right, and just play out a few scenarios, I would prefer as black to kind of just defend h3, even though it's a 5 dis unbalanced h. It's better to kind of resolve that unresolved situation over here. And over here, there isn't a very good move for white. White can't play c square or x square because that gives either the corner immediately or gives like a swindle immediately to the corner. So either way, that's not good. So white's only kind of viable option over here is f2. So with a h3, f2 in mind, right, I would think that black goes here, and it's probably easier to kind of close off the game, maybe this move, and just kind of wait for white to kind of come in on this side and potentially close off the game from here. Yeah, and even here, you can see this is mini diagonal is all white. So even if black takes this, it's basically game over for white. So I think this would have been a very simple approach for black to kind of close off the game. Yeah, so I think closing off h3 is very straightforward. But I think what Tanida did was something else. He played e1, which was the earlier option that I mentioned. And I think he did play out the sequence that I mentioned at the first option. But I guess he in his attempt to kind of maintain a very nice diagonal line between d3 and h7, he forgot that white could play h3, which is a forcing move, because if you don't defend it as black, you will lose the corner, so you're kind of forced to defend it. So h3, h2 is unavoidable, and h3 for white creates f5, and f5 creates the access to c2 for white. So I think in that exchange of tempo, black probably lost its winning position potentially. White, black, white, and then followed by over here, black decides to play the usual a4, which is nothing wrong, but at the same time, I think he was probably caught by surprise by white playing f2 and controlling the diagonal. And again over here, because white has this control of the diagonal between c3 and f6, right, it would be hard for black to actually consider g2 at this point without an access to this main diagonal. So it's a very strong diagonal control for white at this point. And I believe the position is maybe even or even losing for black now with that exchange. So over here, excuse me, black jumped into b1 in search for probably some excess, because if you were to play a3, it would be too loud. And during the closing stages of the game, you don't want to kind of close off the corner of the center 16, because that actually creates more moves for yourself. So you don't want to change c3 and f3 as much as possible to yours, so that you have options to kind of play to. So a3 move is avoided to convert c3 and f3 to black. So maybe that's the reason why he chose b1 to kind of split the disc. But at the same time, you realize he doesn't really have many safe moves to play. So one way to kind of gauge your own situation is that if you would think, if now it's your move, do you have any more moves to play? And evidently for black, there's not many to play from here. So white jumps in, controls two mini diagonals that are coming out to the playing field in a5 and b6. So you can see this mini diagonal between e1 to b4 is completely controlled by white, and f2 to c5 is completely controlled as well. So over here, it seems the tables have turned for black, and now white is in control of the situation here. So yeah, I think that's probably the reason why the situation got reversed, because white is controlling a very strong mini diagonal, and this unbalanced edge is entirely unhindered by the shape on the left, simply because the corner this to c6 is black. The corner of the center 16, I mean. So c6 over here is black, so it doesn't really give black an opportunity to kind of attack this unbalanced edge as well. So white is in control comfortably. So white has so many options to play, maybe a diagonal control move, probably retain the edge first. So to defend this from being cut back, so I think black doesn't have much of an option, and then basically white sealing off that has a few other options to play, feed off the edge, and then over here I think it's a pure parity play, simply because I think white didn't want to take the risk to go into this diagonal control corner, probably to avoid uncertainties, I guess. But I kind of think that it might still be relatively safe, given white has more moves over here. So even if it's black, white, black, white, I think white would still have more than enough moves. But maybe the concern was about this diagonal control of discs. Okay, so yeah. So maybe the sequence that Joanna picked was probably the better one, and then followed by grabbing the corner, and then essentially forcing black. If black would have just jumped in, then black would have just simply lost by parity over here. So black, white, and then even if black takes this, white, and then just to wrap up on either ends. Just a simple close-off game by parity. So just kind of going back to that position earlier, I think that was probably the losing move for black, when black had a very simple way to close off the edge over here. So that exchange allowed white to come back into the game and control key diagonals. If black would have just played h3 here, probably it would be a straightforward sweep game, I guess. So even if white were to play any moves here, it should be fairly straightforward for black to kind of control the game. And if white plays here, then black goes here. Again, I think this would have been a lot easier for black to simply just wrap up the game. So yeah, that's for the game between Tanida and Joanna. So maybe let's go to another game. Let's take a look at what other games that might have been interesting that I could have missed. Okay, maybe Anthony, between Matt and Anthony. So Anthony, being one of the top few players who goes to a lot of World Othello Championship and major tournaments in Japan. I think more recently he's also been quite active, joining a lot of international tournaments representing Singapore. And Matt, obviously we all know that he's been a long-standing top Australian player. So always interesting to see top players play against each other. So let's replay the game. I think white played the diagonal opening while Matt played the cow, and again, this variation seems to be popular among players now. To kind of play a white variation to b5. Okay, so black cut out and white grabs the center, and black just skirts around. So typically, again, in Othello, you either centralize or you try to keep to your side of the board as much as possible so that you can pull your opponent over. So over here, I think white is playing a very bold center strategy, while black is kind of just moving around the parameter of the shape, just to try to retain moves and grab key positions. So I think Matt is very skillful in terms of how he grabs key positions. So it's interesting to see. So over here, black has adopted a strategy to completely just be on the edge and kind of wait for white to jump in. And then, so over here, black jumps into the center to try to gain access to b4. I would have thought that maybe his strategy to take b3 might be to actually go towards the edge first to d1. So it's a bit surprising to kind of see f5 happen, but I think, there are more ways than one to play Othello. In black-white exchange, over here, black grabs the edge. I actually think that black is leading by quite a bit over here. So it's strange that I would have probably preferred b4 over here instead of jumping out to e6. Probably he wants to connect his discs. But I think the f5 disc could have been ignored. Maybe just black and white black perhaps. And just ignore the f5 disc because once the f5 disc is lifted in any way, then this presents itself as a quiet move for black to play. Perhaps. So black, white, followed by black. Probably not the sequence that I prefer, but yeah, it's interesting to see. I think Matt probably values grouping his discs back together, so these 5 discs on top and the bottom disc below. So he didn't want to kind of give up on this f5 disc. And Anthony over here, on the other hand, played g6 just to give an opponent probably 2 options. So typically in Othello, there is this maneuver called the fork, and basically what it means is you want to kind of give your opponent 2 viable options, but at the same time, when you give your opponent 2 viable options, if he takes one of it, you basically take the other. So it becomes quite a simple way to counter in the mid game, at least momentarily. So when white plays g6, essentially he gives b6. He gives black 2 options, either one to g3 or one to f6. So either one, which white would be able to play the other position if he took either one. So if he took g3, white goes f6. And he took f6 in this case, and then maybe white could have considered playing g3. So that was what happened. And then I think Matt probably read the position such that he's maintained into the center after this exchange. So black, white, and then followed by d6. So I actually think that was a good read by Matt, and it looks like Matt is dominating this this mid game position at least. But maybe I'm not too sure whether b6 would have been a mistake by giving white one more consecutive move or a chance to kind of centralize. Probably a simple e7 might have been more straightforward. Maybe he was afraid of c7 and this being a poison move. Yeah, probably. And black just jump in over here. I think maybe Matt was reading slightly more ahead in the game, perhaps. But allowing white to kind of skirt the edges and just pick up moves on the side probably may not be something that I would probably advocate, I guess. So over here, black jumps into the center. Again, I think Matt probably valued his center position, so he knows the play out is for white to kind of skirt around. But at the same time, white did have like additional moves over here to feed off a4 unbalanced h to a2 or to play c6. So that's what happened. Okay, so this game actually looks more even now, considering that the remaining unplayed moves are to the bottom edge and the right edge, and playing any move would actually affect each other, because if you were to play c8, then this basically poisons h3, and given this shape, and if you play d8 for black, and you basically poison a whole lot more moves on the edge. So the strength of white's position over here right now is because all of the remaining moves for black to play suddenly becomes very poisoned, which is something that I think a lot of us tend to only realize on hindsight sometimes on the shape. So you kind of feel like you're in the center, but at the same time, when your opponent wraps up the second layer, suddenly when you're forced to play the moves on the edge, suddenly you feel like you're not on the center anymore because you're forced to play all these poison moves. So over here, let's see what Matt played. So you do have to pick a side. So it's probably easier to pick the side where you can play consecutive moves without as much fear. So if you were to play the bottom edge first, all the moves here will be poisoned. But if you were to play the right edge, you can at least have more moves. I think this edge to the top is less attackable in a sense that if you were to play this and kind of hope for another consecutive move over here, white would still have this option perhaps to attack. So maybe that's what Matt was considering. So black, white, white had to defend simply because white didn't want black to have consecutive moves to h4, and white would have to create some access between the mini diagonal from d1 to g4 so that he can continue to access h5 over here. So black, white, and then black jumps down to f7, maintaining this mini diagonal control between the f2 to g3 disk, which is reasonable, I guess. Yeah, just trying to look for other possibilities. So black, white chips off the edge. So the reason why you want to kind of just chip off the edge is to maintain on your side of the board. At the same time, you try to force black to play more moves for you. So black playing c1 gives probably a move easy for white to jump in. Typically in this configuration edge, you want to be the guy with the two inner discs, which is d1 and e1, as opposed to c1 and f1. Typically d1 and e1 being the center position helps you kind of influence more of the board as opposed to c1 and f1, which is more dispersed. But yeah, different setups have different ways to play. But yeah, in general, I think in Japanese, they call it like a bomb shape or almost like a bakudan shape, which is basically using these two interior discs sandwiched by two of your opponent's discs to kind of extend the influence more in like almost like a diamond, or in their terms more like a bomb shape. Which actually these two discs position does give a lot of influence to kind of consolidate the center. Even if you do lose all the corners, the control of the center tends to be quite a lot of discs. So in this case, black jumped in for the diagonal control. Probably, I think Matt probably already read this position earlier from c1 and expected white to jump in for the exchange, and black jumps in for b2 to kind of consolidate this parity and try to nullify the effect as much as possible for white's center two discs. Because if white kind of finds access to the corner thereafter, then black would just control this kind of mini two-row discs, a two-column disc between B and C columns. So white had no choice but to cut out to try to get the corner access over here early on, and then try to go for the corner perhaps, or go for like maybe a mini swindle for consecutive moves. So maybe G1 over here first, considering that the F2 to b6, this mini diagonal is being controlled by black. In fact, usually we say that you want to kind of control these mini diagonals, but at the same time, you want to try to find ways to kind of exploit your opponent's mini diagonals. And in this case, when white chose to play h2 and black didn't choose to retain any discs along the G column and took h1, this probably gave white a chance to jump in here, perhaps. Yeah, so white did jump in. So by playing this maneuver, white successfully obtained two moves in a row, G1 and G2, or we call it 3 out of 4 in a corner. So if you just look at the corner top 4 on the right, out of these 4 moves, white essentially captured 3. So by capturing 3 out of 4 moves in the corner, you actually gain 2 tempo for white, and 2 tempo is probably enough to try to kind of reverse this losing situation. So white, black, white, and then black is forced to play elsewhere. So in this case, Matt tried to poison white from going to G2 and increase the cost of entry. So white just kind of skirt around, feed the edge first before jumping in eventually. So white chooses to jump over here in. Probably interesting move, but at the same time, if black feeds off and white is forced, then black would actually gain a move here. It's just kind of strange still. And black played the edge, and white went here. Yeah. So this is a swindle. So this is a swindle that white has to take. But at the same time, I think maybe because white established more this in the center over here, so this tempo change was very important, and this kind of maneuver to h6 to feed off the edge first before jumping in was very important for white to kind of capture sufficient interior disc after all of the positions have been played out here. So the remaining influence of black's disc on the remaining seats that are on the top is basically negligible. So white jumps into G7, and then black goes for the swindle. So basically, it's a quiet move against the entire row of this, entire column of this in G column, and then black white, and then black to the corner. Typically, in this situation, actually black would win, but not sure if Matt missed a win line or did he count out the perfect sequence. Yeah, but considering there are so few moves here, I don't think he might have missed. So it's the best sequence based on the rating on the software. So unfortunately for Matt, he did drop that game. Although I did feel that he must have been leading quite a bit in the mid game, but somehow by grabbing the edges, it didn't work out too well for him. Okay, so let's check out another game. Maybe let me just refresh this board. Let's take a look at what other games are ongoing. So maybe Kurita against Urano Kento, two potential world champion caliber and favorites for the title in this tournament, together with Satani, of course, and Shiki Shimomura. And so over here, black is Kurita. The opening is a no Kong opening by white, and Kurita goes for e3 and g6. So g6 is an opening that I see a top British player, Imre leader, play a lot. And I think some of the Europeans play this a lot as well. It's a very kind of edge play driven opening. It's more like a high risk, high return kind of opening. So white, black, white. So white over here configures himself in the center as much as possible, and black more towards the edge and skirting around. So this shape is interesting because it's almost like a one disc control on this diagonal. There's no way white can cut through. So it does look like the shape is extremely bad for black offhand. But at the same time, you realize that I think if you look through most of Kurita's game, he likes to play a lot on the edges, and then finally regroup into the center in a very efficient way. And somehow, that kind of regrouping way actually allows him to play or to gain a lot of tempo over here. So you can see this regrouping move was very loud, but at the same time, it only flipped discs that were in the center. Typically, you wouldn't want to kind of play such a move to kind of flip all the frontier discs to black. But at the same time, it didn't seem like white gained a lot out of this. So white chose to regroup over here, and black jumped out. So I think knowing how Urano has won his world championship almost undefeated in 2022, I think he played almost like a perfect book in most games. So the interesting thing to note is when you see a Japanese player play against amongst themselves, if it's not like a fully booked draw game, maybe one of the opening variations that he's using could be something that is interesting and useful that could be used out of book against maybe some of the Japanese players who play book. So I think this is probably one of the lines that is interesting by Kurita. So I think Kurita does present himself as a player who is able to kind of create something different as opposed to just playing the standard book lines. So over here, black plays c7 and basically controls this mini diagonal over here while maintaining this vertical control of this column of the E column discs. And white is forced to kind of jump in and create access along this. So over here, I can say that black is pretty much in control of the key positions diagonals, but I think it's still fair to say that it's not that far off a game in terms of both players. But interestingly, how black has kind of controlled the position on the edges, which is not your typical kind of Othello game, because over here black white exchange and then followed by black taking e8. It gives black two consecutive moves. So black takes e8, at the same time white is not able to access e7. So the reason why you want to kind of form up such mid-game positions is to control the key diagonal. At the same time, you want to make consecutive moves in such a region. So black took e8 to kind of just ignore and allow white to grab this edge if he wanted to, because it's an edge that you can force him to kind of form an unbalanced edge thereafter. But the main point is black wanted to kind of regroup again to e7, and it's the same logic as the earlier mentioned game where Anthony actually managed to get 2 tempos, 3 out of 4 in the corner, and this is somewhat like more like a 2 out of 2 in the mid game zone. So interestingly, black didn't jump in immediately because that allows white to kind of connect to b4. So instead of playing black white, black decided to first play b4 just to take away that good move from white before jumping into e7, because e7 still remains as a square that only black can go into. So this is something interesting to note. Probably more useful to improve your game as well. So black took one step first and then retained the interior so that white doesn't get into a good position. So white jumps in, still has an easy move, but I think in terms of tempo wise, it does look like black has the advantage. And if you consider things from a parity region perspective, which I think a lot of Japanese tend to emphasize, is that when you're black, in this case Kurita, you want to kind of create an odd region so that you can kind of make your opponent skip one move so that you can retain back parity. So now after this exchange and white jumps into a4, you realize that the top left is 7 discs, 7 squares. So that presents itself as an odd region, which allows, so the remaining parts, the remaining combined region would then be more like an odd region for black. So over here you have 6, 5, and 6 over here. So if there's a way that black can kind of just play out the remaining zones just by exchanging moves, it will lead to a pass, essentially, a pass whereby white has to kind of give up parity. So in general, this creation of shape might have been planned by Kurita as well from a parity perspective. So black can probably choose to play h6 because at the same time, when you cross back, you maintain this diagonal between f4 to c7, so that's also a useful option. Or if not, the other option is to just simply play h3 and grab the edge. So black chose h3 probably because typically h3 is followed by g3, but given that g3 is poisoned because white still has to flip the f2 disc, so that's why black went towards the h3 position. Yeah, so typically if you take the edge and white attacks the edge, you want to grab the edge if you're not able to kind of feed a poison edge. So since if black takes g3, white can have a clean move to h2. That kind of disrupts his plan for parity control to some extent, perhaps. So he just wanted to establish control on the edge. Yeah, so the control, I think, so white is trying to struggle back for parity by playing a quiet g1, but at the same time, black grabs the corner and stabilizes the edge. I think he does have the c1 move to kind of wait for a move and kind of encapsulate that zone on the right, top right, to be an even zone. So yeah, white basically didn't have much of an option but to try to retain parity, but at the same time, creating this 2-disc zone is covered in hyper even theory. So I think the exchange over here, the control for black was very strong. So yeah, usually if you have 3 corners, you basically have a very firm control of the result of the game. So that's that's featured in, I think, Tetsu Satani's book, where I think he did do like a semi calculations simulations over there just to let you know, like if you're in an end game, you're in a tight position, you're trying to figure out you have enough discs. I think typically if you have some 3 corners and 3 key main edges, 3 or 4 key edges, you're pretty sure. Like, because if you have 4 key edges, you at least have some 24 or 28 discs, depending on how the edges are formed. So as long as you have a few intermittent discs, you're basically good to assume that you have sufficient discs to cross the 32 mark. So black control over here. At the same time, this is a very strong second row control. So yeah, basically black had the parity in the last zone. So I think this is a very interesting game. It always tends to look like an entirely different game when you look at 2 Japanese players who are very seasoned and they know the openings and what's the weaknesses. I think it's interesting for probably players who are trying to kind of break into the top tier to kind of look at these games and try to figure out what kind of openings might be useful against each other, besides the standard book. Yeah, so if you look at this opening and you just play it out quickly again, you can tell that it looks very strange. It just seems like you can't really figure out how Black eventually controlled the game. But yeah, if you can look at the minor lines and the minor zone controls, you can see actually Kurita was in control of all the mini diagonals, and he knew exactly when to kind of jump into the timing, especially this B4 move. So typically, if you play blitz, maybe white goes f8, you tend to kind of want to immediately jump into e7. But if you slow down and think, e7 does give away white's b4. So playing b4 first and retaining that, yeah, seems like a very smart maneuver to kind of hold back that position. Okay, so I think, oh, the standings after round 6 are available. So let's maybe just cut over to the standings quickly and just to take a look. So let's just refresh the board. So Kurita goes 6 out of 6 and currently stands at the top of the table. I think today they're playing 7 rounds, so there is one more round to go. Shiki Shimomura, 5 wins, and interestingly, you can see some of the Singapore players also keeping up with 4 wins over here. So the top 6 are Japanese, and there are two other Japanese below. Actually 4 other Japanese below. So a total of 10 Japanese players playing this tournament. So it's kind of nice to see a good mix. So of course this is only just the 6th round. There's still at least 5 more games to be played. Consistency is key again, so anything can happen. So yeah, over here, I think it's not surprising to kind of see a few Singapore, China players, Australian players. Probably a bit more surprising to see some of the Australian players not within the top few, like maybe Scott and Matt and Joanna. I would have expected them to maybe at least feature among the top 10 at this stage. But yeah, I believe they should be able to mount a comeback in terms because they're not too far away. It's just the separation by Brightwell. So we do expect this final standings to kind of shuffle a bit more towards the tail end. And of course, once the Japanese players pair amongst themselves, which is a bit different from the World Othello Championship. Usually, the World Othello Championship only features some 4 or 5 Japanese players. And they don't really get to pair against each other as much. So yeah, probably there would be some form of cannibalism towards the end. So let's take a look at the pairings for round 7. Round 7, yeah. So this is almost like a day 1 final. So this would be an interesting game to see. Shiki Shimomura against Kurita Seiya. And then you have all the Japanese players lined up against one another. So Anthony against Murakami should be an interesting Singapore versus Japan match. And then you also have Singapore versus China. Singapore against Japan again over here. Australia, Ivan against Keita Omori. So a lot of interesting games to be seen. Let's maybe refresh this board just to see whether we can find any more interesting games to talk about. Let's take a look. So maybe we can take a look at Urano Kento with Scott, given that I know Scott is very good at playing out of book openings. I think he had an amazing match in the 2011 World Othello Championship with Tim Criswonos from Canada. You should probably check that out. It was quite a crazy game, I think. So over here, Black plays standard Stephenson, Scott plays Kong opening. So I think the Kong opening does not surprise the Japanese much because they play this a lot as well. So, and the typical book sequence is for Black to jump into a5. And if you see kind of Kento Urano playing d2, it's probably an intended out of book position to kind of move your opponent out of book. Typically, when you play Kong, I think White wants to kind of get into the fixed sequence to play the usual moves. Black, White, okay. So the exchange was about maintaining the center. Black jumps in over here into the center while maintaining against this mini diagonal, so keeping the moves clean. Scott jumps in over here. I actually think that Scott's position isn't too bad. But yeah, because of this, White is kind of forced to play a5. And a5 basically creates this d2 to a5 diagonal that allows Black to jump into a potential consecutive moves. So if you look at the exchange, White is forced to play here. Black jumps in and kind of weaves in between. At the same time, White wouldn't want to play f1 and give d1 to the opponent so easily because that allows Black to kind of form that shape that we talked about earlier in the center. And basically this mini diagonal is also controlled by Black. So e2 to g4 mini diagonal is controlled by Black, so there isn't a chance for White to cut back as well. So this is a very nice sequence planned by Gento Urano, and I think gave him a very good position to kind of take two moves in one single zone over here. So there are similarities between the Japanese play. You can see that they're basically trying to evaporate your mobility on the board by playing these moves, and White is kind of forced to either play g3 or d1, but at the same time it's interesting to kind of see Scott kind of shuffle it up and play a g7 move. So typically this is like probably like a very high risk move to kind of go into that like square early on, probably because he sensed that his tempo wasn't enough. And I guess that kind of move wouldn't be very effective against a former world champion who controls the tempo pretty well. So in this zone, you can see that it's pretty much a bad parity position as well for White. If White were to just go into a7 and Black captures two moves in a row, it can be quite detrimental as well. So yeah, over here it turns out to be quite a straightforward win for Mr. Kento. So over here, this position, White was forced to give up two consecutive moves. Okay. So I mean, it's to be honest, it's kind of sad in a way. You can see that most of the world seems to be a bit away from the Japanese. The Japanese does know the game a little bit better than the rest of the world. Only the kind of select few like Anchuli from Thailand, Ben Sealy from America, and the top European players can actually compete with the Japanese. And yet, even if we can take some games off them, it seems like the overall consistency is still better. So it does still feel like a bit of skill and a bit of knowledge in terms of the opening selection. So let's take a look at maybe some of the live games, and then we can probably move on from there. So Scott against Samuel. This looks like an incomplete game, so maybe let me just refresh the board. So as I understand, I think the players are actually keying in the positions themselves with the tablet that's on the board. So this round, it seems like the live Othello hasn't gone up yet. Maybe they're having a break before the last round. Because it still seems stuck at Kurita against Satani, and the game did not complete as well. So yeah, I guess some of the games are incomplete, and having the players probably key in their own moves is probably not the best, since they could be more preoccupied with playing the game. So you can see a lot of these games seems to be incomplete, or maybe they will load the sequence after. So I think for now it's interesting to kind of see, but yeah, you can see that most of the Japanese players are on top, and I think the key difference right now between Japan and the rest of the world is just the minor details when it goes into the mid game in terms of where they're kind of choosing to gain tempo, which are shapes whereby many of us may not be that familiar. So opening preparation as well. I think some of them know the openings that would be more mistake inducing. So if you want to improve your game, probably you have to look up the openings that are being used by the top players. At the same time, try to kind of understand the mid-game maneuvers that they're doing. I think besides the mid-game maneuvers that I do cover on my other videos, there are still some that are very minor or nuanced in the mid-game where the Japanese definitely studies the position a lot more. For example, the earlier ones that we mentioned in Kurita's game and also Kento's game. So yeah, I think this would be interesting to kind of see this play out. So I think for now I'll be signing off day one, and I'll probably see you guys tomorrow if I get some time to kind of comment on day two. Hopefully, you can look at the finals, maybe the game two or game three live, and then maybe look at some games retrospectively and just look at the final result together. So thank you very much for joining me, for whoever who stayed till the end, and I'll catch you guys at the next one. Goodbye.